We'll call this hearing to order, the first hearing of the 118th Congress for the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability. Welcome. As chairman, I intend to focus this committee's attention and resources on its core mission to ensure our government is working for the American people in an efficient manner. Agencies guard taxpayer funds from fraudsters and ineligible participants, and political leadership be held accountable for bad consequences of their policies. Last Congress, Democrats strayed far from this mission. The Biden administration faced little to no scrutiny under unchecked, one-party Democrat rule in Washington. This committee conducted almost no oversight of federal government agencies, programs, or policies. The nonpartisan Lugar Center gave Democrats an F in oversight last Congress. Instead, this committee spent its time and resources demonizing America's oil and gas industry, investigating an NFL football team, and examining pet, flea, and tick collars. The American people have suffered from the lack of oversight and accountability. Crises have continued and worsened. Our nation is facing the worst border crisis in American history. Fentanyl, which is coming across the southern border, is the leading cause of death for many Americans. Americans are facing high energy prices resulting from policies aimed at diminishing domestic energy production. And the American people have struggled with consequences of prolonged COVID closures and lockdowns, inflation, and shortages of labor and goods. That's why this first hearing is so important. Today's hearing is a first step in examining the massive waste, fraud, and abuse in COVID relief programs. In March of 2020, the United States struggled to respond to growing threats presented by COVID-19. With the economy on the brink of collapse, Congress passed a series of bills intended to both fund the public health response and keep the economy afloat. The largest of these measures was the bipartisan CARES Act. It created programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, which saved jobs at small businesses across the country. It rolled out pandemic unemployment insurance to help American workers who were victims of business closures and spiking unemployment. These programs brought relief to many Americans. But with massive government spending comes opportunity for waste, fraud, and abuse. Unfortunately, Democrats conducted little oversight of the over $2 trillion spent under the CARES Act. They did the exact opposite. They spent another $2 trillion, but this time with absolutely no protections or guardrails to prevent waste. And worse, they spent this money when there was no sign that it was actually needed. This out-of-control spending led to 40-year high inflation, kept people out of work longer, and harmed our economy. During the markup of this legislation, many of us warned that without oversight mechanisms in place, taxpayer dollars were at risk of being misused or lost to fraud, waste, or abuse. Republican amendments would have put strings attached on those dollars. They would have allowed for oversight. But Democrats voted down every single amendment we offered. And what happens if there's no oversight? Nothing good. We've seen reports that between $163 to $400 billion in unemployment insurance benefits were paid out improperly. We've seen reports that between $76 to more than $100 billion in Paycheck Protection Program and economic injury and disaster loan programs were lost to improper payments. We've seen reports that $266 billion in improper payments were made by Medicaid during the pandemic. That's why we're having our first hearing of the new Congress on waste, fraud, and abuse in pandemic spending programs. We will hold many more of these hearings on this important issue. We owe it to the American people to get to the bottom of the greatest theft of American taxpayer dollars in history. We must identify where this money went, how much ended up in the hands of fraudsters or ineligible participants, and what should be done to ensure that it never happens again. This committee will evaluate the hundreds of billions of dollars in grants and loans doled out for nearly every agency in the federal government to ensure those funds were appropriately used to respond to the pandemic and not wasted on ineligible payees or unrelated matters. We will investigate the $189 billion in elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, money meant to help reopen schools and address learning loss. Instead, these funds were often used on unrelated expenditures and even to push divisive ideologies onto our students. We will work to ensure that the watchdogs in our offices of inspectors general and our law enforcement officers, agents, and prosecutors have the tools they need to track down fraudsters and recover illegally obtained COVID-19 taxpayer funds. This committee has for too long stood on the sidelines while taxpayer dollars were wasted by bureaucrats whose only priority is getting money out the door. Today, we will hear from Inspector General Michael Horowitz, GAO's Comptroller General Gene Dodaro, and Assistant Director David Smith with the Office of Investigations at the Secret Service. Thank you all for being here to testify about your efforts to conduct oversight of pandemic funding. I now yield to Ranking Member Raskin for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you kindly. Our committee's purpose is to ensure that government is effectively delivering on its promises to the American people. And as the new ranking member, I'm eager to work with you and the rest of the committee in carrying out this shared responsibility in a thorough, serious, nonpartisan, and even-handed way. When I heard that our first hearing would spotlight pandemic relief programs, I was pleased because I thought it would follow up on everything the Democratic majority had been doing in the 117th Congress since COVID-19 began. I was hopeful for an opportunity to consider together how we can identify schemes of fraud and self-enrichment, ripping off the taxpayers, and continue to strengthen the structural efficiency of critical government programs that help families and businesses across America meet the challenges of the pandemic. Just as the political system and the campaign finance system have recently been proven shockingly vulnerable to imposters, hustlers, con men, big liars, outright fraudsters, and fakes, some of the programs developed to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic have proven vulnerable to the relentless, deceitful, and fraudulent designs of criminal predators when they too decide to exploit the generosity of the American people. The traditional language of waste, fraud, and abuse does not quite capture the confidence games and organized criminal artifices and schemes that have targeted and exploited relief programs built on the solidarity and goodwill of the American people. The House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus, which was chaired in the last Congress by then Majority Whip Clyburn, in which I served on, led the effort to identify and combat these criminal actors. The subcommittee conducted no fewer than 7 hearings focused on rooting out fraud in relief programs. I will never forget how under Chairman Clyburn's leadership, in our first week or two of existence, the subcommittee recovered an improper $10 million Paycheck Protection Program loan. Less than 3 months later, we helped secure the return of $109 million from a nursing home chain that was not using the loan as Congress had specifically intended. In March of 2021, we exposed how the Trump administration's reckless mismanagement of small business relief programs and refusal to implement basic anti-fraud controls led to nearly $84 billion in fraudulent loans. Just months later, we issued another report highlighting how the Trump administration awarded $95.7 million in pandemic food box program funds to 3 companies that all raised severe red flags. Then again, in April of 2022, we showed how Trump White House officials overruled career Department of Defense officials to approve a $700 million national security loan to a single company in violation of legal requirements, and so on. We used the spotlight and bully pulpit of a small subcommittee to expose and reverse colossal frauds taking place against the American people. While I remain optimistic that this hearing can meaningfully explore ways to ensure that taxpayer dollars go where intended, I confess I'm troubled that some of our colleagues seem to want to cherry-pick facts and deploy distorted figures to attack the underlying legitimacy of the programs themselves, the programs that were a lifeline and salvation for millions of businesses and families across the country. Recall that while the former president denied, trivialized, and dismissed the COVID-19 pandemic, it was Congress which acted responsibly and swiftly and in bipartisan fashion to create and supercharge programs that saved countless businesses and families from bankruptcy and ruin. These programs included expanded unemployment insurance benefits and the PPP program, which empowered families and businesses to avoid economic collapse. As a result of our actions, the COVID-19 economic recession was the shortest on record. The programs were by no means perfect. Antique government IT systems, many running on obsolete software, collapsed and were incapable of adapting to the scope of the crisis. States entered the pandemic at a 50-year low for unemployment insurance system funding, and UI claims burgeoned from 211,000 to 6.6 million, a 3,000% increase over a three-week period in March of 2020. People unsure of how they would pay their housing or medical bills panicked as they waited hours on phone calls for customer service representatives or reached endless busy signals in unemployment insurance purgatory. My home state of Maryland was no exception. In the one-year period from March 2020 until March 2021, my district office received 1,400 anguished constituent requests for help with unemployment. This is in contrast to one constituent request we received in all of 2019. Congress asked agencies and states to do the near impossible, and they did their very best. Expanded UI benefits kept an estimated 5 to 6 million people out of poverty in 2020 and 6.7 million people above the poverty line in 2021. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that expanded benefits may have saved the lives of as many as 27,000 people in high-risk occupations who may have died from COVID had they not had access to benefits. Organized criminals and fraudsters took advantage of these circumstances by exploiting weaknesses in our IT systems. This problem was compounded by critical decisions made by the Trump administration that hamstrung pandemic relief anti-corruption oversight from the very outset, crippling the government's ability to detect fraud. Despite specific legislative instruction from Congress in our pandemic relief bills, the Trump administration regularly told agencies to ignore data reporting requirements. But congressional Democrats and the Biden administration have worked diligently from the start to recover funds stolen by organized criminal groups and other fraudsters, help states modernize their IT systems, and build new structural capacities to detect and prevent fraud. Under President Biden's leadership, departments and agencies across the government moved swiftly to strengthen program integrity and bolster efforts to prevent, detect, and pursue fraud, which festered under the lackadaisical stewardship of the prior administration. In the days preceding this hearing, Republicans have claimed that Democrats on this committee and in the Biden administration neglected to conduct meaningful oversight of these programs. The record demonstrates these assertions are baseless. Democrats have systematically ferreted out fraud, waste, and abuse in pandemic relief, although we all can certainly be doing a much more effective job, and that's what this hearing should be about. As the work of the 118th Congress commences, I urge all of my colleagues across the aisle and on our side to remember the crucial role this committee must play in eliminating fraudulent schemes by imposters in order to protect the integrity of the programs that we adopt and that America needs. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield back.